So this week we're going to talk about pagan consent culture. As some of you may know, this was the title of a book that I co-edited with Christine Hofkramer. And if you are well versed in this topic of consent, you will recognise why there are pictures of cups of tea in this presentation, because there's a very famous video and blog post called Consent and Tea. So we will get into that in a bit. So what I want to look at in this video is, how do we understand consent culture in the pagan community? What are the barriers to creating more of it? How can we ground it in a pagan worldview? And how does it work in your local culture? Because obviously different cultures have different ideas about what needs to be consented to and how, because consent isn't just about you know, whether you consent to sex or not. It's whether you consent to any form of touch or any form of activity that you may or may not desire to participate in. One good example that I thought of recently was some people, in an effort to be hospitable, like to top up your glass of wine. Now, I like to pace myself when I'm drinking wine or beer or spirits or anything else. And if somebody's constantly topping up your glass in an effort to be hospitable, then you can't pace yourself. So because I like to drink my one glass that I've got, get to the end of it, have a glass of water as my next drink, and then have another glass of wine, and then stop at about 4 glasses. Well, if somebody's kind of going, oh, would you like some more? And not taking no for an answer, then you can't gauge how much you've drunk. So consent is important in every area of life, not just sexual consent. And, you know, different cultures have different expectations and norms around how we deal with food and drink and, you know, all kinds of activities, including hugging and touch and kissing on the cheek and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so, and how we signal that we don't want those things in subtle or more overt ways. Okay, so looking at how we understand consent culture in the pagan community. Now, there are obviously, the pagan community is very often seen as a sex positive community, which means that we value sexual interaction and sexual love, and that we regard that as part of life and wholesome and life affirming and all that stuff. However, and this is a big however, there's also an issue of potentially being sex pressuring. Now, Misha Maudlin points out that, you know, if you have a sex pressuring, sex positive culture, then it's not a sex positive culture. It's actually bordering on, or actually is, rape culture. So I suppose now would be a good moment to explain the difference between a consent culture and a rape culture. So in a consent culture, we assume that everybody has or should have autonomy and personhood and a right to consent or decline sexual activity, right? So it's the end, and this is based on the idea that everybody has a right to enjoyment of sexual activity in peace. So it's not that you have a right to sex, you have a right to enjoy the sexual activities you choose to participate in, and that other people have chosen to participate with you in a peaceful manner, right? That's sex positive. And also that everybody has an absolute right to decline sexual activity. Nobody has a right to demand sexual activity with you. And it honours people's knowledge and understanding of their own body and their own desires. Now, conversely, in a rape culture, there is an assumption that women cannot meaningfully consent to sex, because according to the tropes that do the rounds in consent culture, women don't actually really like sex, and therefore have to be either coerced or cajoled into sex. And so this becomes an excuse, a very poor excuse, obviously, for rape and coercion into sexual activity. Now, I think this myth that women don't like sex is perpetuated by both certain types of feminists that we tend to call radical feminists. Not all radical feminists, but there's a strong overlap with trans excluding radical feminists, probably unsurprisingly, and also is obviously perpetuated by patriarchal, misogynistic men, such as men's rights activists and the infamous incels or involuntary celibates, which started off as a perfectly innocuous forum for people who were celibate but didn't want to be, and then turned into a massive hotbed of misogyny and violence and general horrific behavior and attitudes. Anyway, so the difference between a consent culture and a rape culture is that consent culture celebrates consent and puts that first and foremost in all its discussions of sexual activity and indeed any other activity. Now, very clearly, we don't live in a consent culture. And what those of us who are active on this topic are trying to do is move people towards a consent culture. On the other side of the other end of the extreme, we have what is known as rape culture, which is a culture that basically promotes rape. Now, examples of that are in the pagan community. You sometimes see tropes about the god chasing the goddess around the forest, and having his wicked way with her, which is really, really icky and horrible and not the sort of thing we want to see in the pagan community. Thank you very much. So you'd think that consent culture would be completely uncontroversial, wouldn't you? But there are some people who make the assumption that this means that no one can ever have sex again, no one can ever hug anyone again, and no one can, make love under the stars in the forest or whatever. Now, obviously, this is extremely far from the truth, because no one in the consent culture activist community is trying to prevent anyone from having sex. What we are promoting is consensual sex. And as I often say, it's an interesting little thing that happens when I start talking about consent, and consent to hugging in particular. Now, the first article I saw about consent to hugging was actually an excellent article by Thorne Mooney. And it was pointing out that, there are some people who don't want to hug. Now, if you go to a lot of pagan events, you will have people, picking you, grabbing you for a hug without so much as a by your leave in some events. Now, this is obviously a real problem if you are, for example, on the autism spectrum, because a lot the action of hugging can be physically and mentally overwhelming for somebody who is on the autism spectrum. And also there are those, it usually is men, because they have the physical strength to do so, that kind of pick you up bodily, and your feet are kind of going like this on a couple of inches off the ground, and your ribs are crushed by their arms as they pick you up bodily off the ground and hug you. It is horrible, and also potentially very bad for the back. And another example is the kind of, and again, it's usually men, but it sometimes is women, who hug you in a sort of overly sexual way. It's kind of like a dog shagging your leg, and it's just icky. And so, I enjoy hugging, not that kind of hugging. I enjoy a good hug, but I would much prefer a hug that I have consented to over one that I haven't. And also, the people who hug in the icky ways that I just described, I'd rather never hug those people again. So the opportunity to politely refuse a hug would be really useful. And one of the things I've noticed about hugs that I've actually consented to tend to be that you're more relaxed in a hug that you've consented to, and it usually lasts a bit longer because it's like, oh, we know we're not itching to pull away from the hug because we know we've consented to it, and it's actually a much more satisfactory experience. So yeah, the reason I chose a picture of a tug of war for this slide is because sometimes it does feel like having a tug of war over the definition of what sex positive might mean, and indeed the issue of hugging. And I mean, it's not just about hugging and who you consent to have sex with. It's like, if you go to a workshop, there's a reasonable expectation that the workshop has been adequately described so that if you find the activity that's going to take place in the workshop difficult, then you are forewarned and you have the opportunity to stay away from the workshop or decline to participate in the activity. Now, I personally find hermetic style of magic actually makes me quite ill. So if somebody was doing a workshop on hermetic magic, I'd appreciate it if they said in advance, this is going to include actual visualizations or journeying that is based on hermetic magic, so that I could decline to attend that workshop. That would be very useful. And there are other examples of types of magic that people might not be comfortable with, which should be explicitly stated in the description of the workshop. So yeah, I think, we need to have a sensible conversation about consent in the pagan community, and it needs to start from a place where people aren't assuming that, oh, those people over there, they're killjoys, or those people over there embrace rape culture, or whatever. We just need to actually sit down, define our terms, and talk in a sensible way about these issues. Now, thankfully, most people are quite sensible about these issues. But there are always people who want to mischaracterize another person's position on this topic. So what are the barriers to creating consent culture? So as I said, I think the fact that there are two kind of different points of view on this topic, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and there's also the issue of secrecy. And, can you meaningfully consent to something that you don't actually know in advance what it is? Because it's meant to have an element of surprise, like initiation. And I will come to that in a minute. And obviously the fact that there isn't just one pagan culture, there are many different spiritual paths with different mythological, philosophical and theological views within paganism. None of that would be a barrier to creating consent culture, but it does mean that we'll be coming at it with different perspectives. Okay. So I think it's very valuable to try to ground our concept of consent culture in a pagan worldview. And in the anthology that I co-edited with Christine Hofkramer, about the first third of the book is devoted to contributions from people seeking to ground their consent culture in their particular pagan worldview. So there's an excellent piece by John Beckett talking about Druidry and sovereignty and consent. This is a great piece by Julian Betkovsky, and there's one from me on how we relate consent culture to initiation in Wicca, and to what extent the the Wiccan initiation ritual actually does seek to get the consent of the initiate, of the candidate for initiation, as it proceeds throughout the ritual. And we also have a contribution from Heathen talking about honour in heathenry and how that works in relation to consent. The different perspectives from polytheism, and there's also a contribution from a Thelemite talking about consent in Thelema. So one of the issues that's difficult to square the circle of is, as I said, consent versus the secrecy and element of surprise. So when you have an initiation ritual, the contents of the initiation ritual are revealed to you in the ritual. So can you meaningfully consent to that without knowing the contents of the ritual? Tricky, right? So before we get into that, I want to look at the different types of consent that there are. So there is consent in the sense of trusting the other person to not harm you, but not knowing the contents of the thing. Then we have informed consent, which is where you know what's coming and you have fully consented to it with your knowledge of what's going to happen. And then there's enthusiastic consent, which is very important in the sexual side of things, where you have, by enthusiastically consenting to something, it's not just, yeah, I suppose so, all right then. It's, yes, I really want to do that thing. And that's, enthusiastic consent should be the thing that we're looking for in a sexual situation, because merely acquiescing to some kind of sexual activity is not where we want to be, right? So in an initiation, one of the things that you know is that everybody else in the community has undergone that same ritual. And there's also some assumptions, or that should be very firmly in place, which are that nothing's going to be inserted into your body, right? There's nothing like that. If somebody tells you that sex is an essential and necessary part of an initiation, run a mile, because that's not the case. I have heard of situations where people have insisted on kissing with tongues, or like French kissing, in a ritual situation. That is not the norm, and it is not appropriate unless their explicit verbal consent has been given in advance, and that explicit verbal consent was not coerced in any way. And I think, it's also important to mention that it is never appropriate for a teacher or a high priest or high priestess or priestess to have sex with have any kind of sexual relationship with their trainee or their covenants, and that the simple reason for that is because there is a power difference between the teacher and the student. And so it is never appropriate to have sexual relationships with students. If you're going to, if you feel yourself having urges in that direction, as Misha Maudlin points out in their excellent book, Outside the Charmed Circle, there is no excuse for acting on those urges. If you find the feelings to be overwhelming, then it's probably best to end the teacher-student relationship, have a breather, and then if the feelings are reciprocated, have a relationship in a different context. But it is never appropriate for teachers and students to have a sexual relationship, because the consent cannot be, and it's not given on the consent such as exists cannot be happening on a level playing field. So it's just not right. I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say on this topic. As far as the initiation goes, I think it would be good if some of the more potentially controversial aspects of the initiation were discussed in advance, because it won't detract from the experience, but people will go into it with more of a preparation. And one suggestion for that might be to allow people to see the oath in advance so they actually know what they're swearing. That would make a lot of sense. And to discuss the ramifications of that. Also to help people to understand what secrecy in the craft is for and what it is not for. I did a chapter on that with Fred, which I wrote with Fred Lamond, and it's in my book, All Acts of Love and Pleasure, Inclusive Wicca. So that might be something you might want to follow up on. Okay, so how does consent work in your local culture? Now, some cultures are much more assertive than other cultures. And the reason I selected these two pictures for this slide is because of a funny story that happened to me. Now, I am British, okay, very specifically English. This means that I am very reticent about complaining about anything, okay? So I was in a hotel room. This must have been, I think this was about 2006, 2007. And the guy in the hotel room next door to me had gone to sleep and left his TV on. And it was really loud and it got quite late in the evening. And I was obviously going to have some trouble getting to sleep with this very loud TV. So I thought, right, well, you know, I need to ring reception and get them to go and sort it out, right? So anyway, I kind of reached for the phone. Oh, no, mustn't complain, mustn't grumble. Oh, no, I'll just try and sleep. No, it'll be fine. No, oh dear, it's really loud. I am going to have to, reach for the phone again. Still couldn't bring myself to actually do it. Right? So, I mustn't grumble. Okay, eventually on the third go, I actually did pick up the phone and somewhat apologetically ring reception and say, hi, there's a guy in the room next to me and I think he's gone to sleep and left his TV on. Now, the interesting thing is I have recounted this story to a group of Canadians and to a group of Italians. And the Italian group basically said, well, you know, I just go and bang on the guy's door and tell him to shut up. And I think about half of the Canadians said the same thing. They pretty much all said they wouldn't have a problem. They wouldn't be reticent to phone reception. Okay. So I think this weird diffidence is a peculiarly British thing. Anyway, so take a moment to think about how you might deal with that situation. I mean, also there's the possibility that if you go and bang on the guy's door and tell him to shut up, that he might get violent, which is why I would have kind of instinctively rung reception. Again, depends on the culture. Anyway, the point of telling this story is as a preamble to how we deal with being assertive and saying no, okay? Because there are, and the reason I initially raised this story in this context was that somebody was saying, oh, but when pagan women are really assertive and strong, so, you know, they should just be able to fend off unwanted sexual advances. And I said to this person, you think of me as a strong person, right? You think that I'm very assertive and you know, able to fend off unwanted stuff. And they said, oh yeah, obviously. And I said, and then I told them the story of me in the hotel room trying to complain. And I said, and that would be me in the situation of fending off unwanted sexual advances as well. I'd be like, oh, well, I don't really want to, but you know, and not actually wanting to offend the person by saying an outright no, maybe, but you know. And if you remember some of the stories that came out of the Me Too movement, in a way, the whole point of the Me Too movement was those situations that a certain generation of women might have thought of as bad sex, but which were actually not exactly rape, but not really, definitely not enthusiastically consented to sex. And there's this whole kind of icky grey area between actual out and out rape and enthusiastic consent, right? Now, a lot of people would want to lump that grey area into basically sexual assault. Wherever you want to classify that grey area, it's still undesirable behaviour. You know, if I say I should be able to say no without having to explain why I don't want to do the particular thing, whether it's sex or unwanted touch or whatever it is, I should just be able to say, no, I don't want that. And I shouldn't have to explain myself. And I shouldn't then be on the receiving end of a load of abuse about how I'm frigid or something. You know, if I say, no, I don't want to hug, no, I don't want sex, no, I don't want to do whatever, there shouldn't need to be a huge explanation on why not. It should just be, no thanks, that's it. Now, another example is in British culture, it's not really the norm to kind of greet people by doing the air kiss thing or the kissing on the cheek thing, right? And there are certain somewhat over enthusiastic individuals who want to introduce this into British culture. I hate it. Like, leave me alone. No, 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 just no, right? I mean, if I go to Italy or somewhere where that is the norm, then fine, that's different. But it feels, people trying to introduce that into British culture is just like, no, go away. You know, one time there was this guy who was really into this and he was trying to do it to me and I was just like, please don't. And then ended up being this really long conversation about why not. And it shouldn't have been. It's just been, I don't want that. I shouldn't have to explain. Just leave me alone. Thanks. You know, it should be really, really simple. One of the reasons I hate it, incidentally, is that I'm left-handed, so I never know which side they're going to start. You know, I think they tend to start on the right, but maybe it's the left, and I always end up just not knowing where to put my face, which anyway, so horrible. Leave me alone. And also, you know, like a hug is not a sexual thing, so don't include kissing in it unless you know the person really, really well. So, glad we got that sorted. So, consent exercises. Here are some reassuring cuddly animals for your viewing pleasure. One of the consent exercises that's really useful is actually just practicing asking other people for a hug. Now, some cultures where they're better at kind of using body language to communicate these things, they don't necessarily need to verbally ask, right? So this exercise doesn't necessarily translate well from one culture to another. With that caveat, I do think it's a worthwhile exercise. So basically, you have a group of people, you divide them up into pairs, and first of all, so like I stand there with my partner for the exercise, and I say, "Would you like a hug?" And they say, "No, thanks." And I go, "Okay." And then the same the other way. And then after a short break, I then say, "Would you like a hug?" And they say, "Yes." And then we hug, and vice versa. So it's just a way of understanding without context and without any sort of pressure what it feels like when somebody says no to a hug. And then now I'm not necessarily suggesting that we automatically need to actually verbally ask for hugs, but it is good hugging etiquette to kind of do the telegraph that. Sorry, I'm trying to do it within the webcam. So this is me waving my arms around going, would you like a hug? And then if the person doesn't want a hug, they kind of can take a step back and kind of go like that or something, right? And the people who actually find it physically painful to hug will thank you for leaving them alone. So there's also been pagan events where people have done a badge or a button system where like green means go ahead and hug me, red means no, and amber means please ask or something like that. But I think, to be honest, it's probably a good idea to just inculcate into everybody that you ask first, either by doing the telegraph thing or actually verbally asking if you don't know the person very well, right? So to this end, on my Zazzle shop, I have also these badges or buttons. If you live in North America, they're called buttons. If you live in the UK, they're called badges. But anyway, these guys, you can get them from my Zazzle shop. There's one that says ask before hugging and another one that says no hugs, thank you. And we also have on our website, pagan-consent-culture.com, lots of exercises and other further resources and reading material that you can read. And obviously the website is intended to accompany the book. Now, one of those linked to resources will, of course, be Consent and Tea. If you haven't read Consent and Tea, it is incredibly brilliant and witty introduction to the subject of consent. And it's based on the idea that there's this person and they've made you a cup of tea, right? And the person is saying, so person A has made person B a cup of tea, and person B says, I don't really want a cup of tea, thanks. Now, obviously, person A is then not going to pour the cup of tea down person B's throat, nor are they going to say, oh, well, you wanted tea yesterday, so you obviously want tea today. Or, well, I like my tea with sugar in it, so why don't you? Or, you know, they're not going to start pouring. No, I said they're not going to pour the tea down the person's throat. Anyway, and it's basically saying, it comes out with all the things that excuses that people have used for sort of pressuring other people into sex, but in the context of tea. And reading it in the context of tea, you understand how ridiculous these excuses or so-called reasons actually are. And it's brilliant. It's genius. And it's written by a person called Rockstar Dinosaur Pirate Princess, and it's very, very good. So check it out. And there's also a video version of it as well. So, okay, further reading on this subject. Eros and Touch from a Pagan Perspective is by Christine Hoff-Kramer, and it's very good. And it deals with, you know, how to embrace consensual, loving touch and Eros. Great stuff. It is priced for the academic market, so, you know, maybe club together with your friends to buy a copy. Then we have Outside the Charmed Circle, Exploring Gender and Sexuality in Magical Practice by Misha Maudlin, and it's brilliant, really, really good, very enjoyable, and has a really good chapter on consent. Fantastic stuff. Very highly recommended. And as I said earlier, our Pagan Consent Culture anthology, which includes writing from John Beckett and Julian Bekovsky and a host of other great, excellent pagan authors on the topic of consent culture and building consent culture. So highly recommended. Okay, do check out my other videos. I've got a bunch of stuff on the history of witchcraft, recovering from fundamentalism, cultural appropriation, potted history of paganism, basics of witchcraft, and talking about queer spirituality and inclusive Wicca. So check out my channel, do hit subscribe on there so you never miss one. And while you're at it, check out my books, Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, and The Night Journey, Witchcraft as Transformation. These are available from the Doreen Valiente Foundation online shop, which is at shop.doreenvaliente.org. All right, till next time, blessed be, take care out there, and see you next time.